There was no iceberg, no storm, no collision in the dark, no distress call from the middle of the ocean. On the morning of July 24th, 1915, a passenger ship rolled onto its side and died, while it was still tied to the dock in the middle of one of America's largest cities, in about 20 feet of water, with half the city close enough to watch. By the time it was over, more passengers had died here, a few yards from shore, than died on the Titanic, and almost no one remembers it happened. This is the story of the Eastland disaster, the deadliest shipwreck in the history of the Great Lakes, and one of the worst maritime disasters the United States has ever seen. When we picture a ship going down, we picture the open sea. We picture the Titanic, the iceberg, the freezing North Atlantic, the lifeboats lowered into the dark. We've been taught that disasters at sea happen far from help, far from land, far from anyone who could do anything about it. The Eastland breaks all of that. It killed at least 844 people without ever leaving the dock. It capsized in calm water, in broad daylight, in front of a crowd. And the single thing that doomed it wasn't bad weather or bad luck. It was a law. A law written to save lives. Written, in fact, because of the Titanic. To understand how that's possible, we have to go back before that morning, to a ship that had been trying to tip over for more than a decade, to the warnings everyone heard and ignored, and to the 2 minutes that turned a company picnic into a city of funerals. This is how a ship can become a death trap before it ever moves. The Eastland was launched in 1903, built to carry passengers on day trips across Lake Michigan. She was long, narrow, and fast, and from the very beginning, she had a problem. She was top-heavy. Here's the idea that explains this entire disaster, and it's simpler than it sounds. Every ship floats around a balance point. Down low, you have its center of gravity, the average of all its weight. The lower that point sits, the more stable the ship. It wants to stay upright, like a weighted toy that rocks and rights itself. But raise that weight, add it up high on the upper decks, and the balance point climbs with it. Push it high enough, and the ship no longer wants to right itself. It wants to roll. The Eastland's weight sat too high almost from the day she was built, and the people who knew her best could feel it. In July of 1904, barely a year into service, she nearly capsized with around 3,000 people aboard. Crew reportedly used fire hoses to push back the panicking crowd. In 1906, she listed so badly that formal complaints were filed. Over the years, her passenger limit was lowered, raised, argued over. Among the people who worked the Chicago waterfront, she earned a nickname, the hoodoo boat, the unlucky one. In 1913, a naval architect looked her over and warned, in writing, that unless her defects were fixed, there could be a serious accident. The passengers, one historian later wrote, seemed to understand the danger better than the inspectors did, so the warnings were there for years. The near misses had already happened, which raises the only question that matters. If everyone knew, how was the Eastland allowed to load 2,500 people on a summer morning? And why did the one change, meant to make her safer, become the thing that killed her? To explain that, we have to leave Chicago for a moment and go to the North Atlantic 3 years earlier. When the Titanic sank in 1912, the world learned a brutal lesson. There hadn't been nearly enough lifeboats. Over 1,500 people died, in part because there was nowhere for them to go. The outrage was immediate, and it crossed the ocean. In March of 1915, the United States passed the La Follette Seamen's Act. Among other things, it required passenger ships to carry enough lifeboats and rafts for nearly everyone aboard. It was a good law, a humane law. It was written by people determined that no one would ever again drown for want of a seat in a boat. And here's the terrible part. For a ship like the Eastland, already top-heavy, already prone to rolling, adding a full set of lifeboats meant piling tons of new weight exactly where she could least afford it, high up, on the upper decks. By that summer, she was carrying close to a dozen lifeboats, dozens of heavy rafts, and life jackets for everyone aboard. The ship's owners had a choice. They could carry fewer passengers, or they could add the lifeboats and qualify to carry more. They chose more. The extra boats let them license the Eastland for over 2,500 people. So the equipment meant to save lives in a sinking made the ship far more likely to capsize in the first place. The cure was poured straight onto the wound, and no one ran the test to see what it would do. On the morning of July 24th, none of the people walking up the gangway knew any of this. They knew it was a holiday. They knew the band was playing. They were going to a picnic. There were more than 2,000 of them, and most were below deck. The picnic belonged to the Western Electric Company, specifically to the workers of its Hawthorne plant, just outside the city. It was the company's annual outing, and it was the highlight of the year for thousands of working families. A lake crossing, a park, a day off in the middle of a hard-working life. For many of the people boarding that morning, this was the closest thing they had to a vacation. They began boarding around 6:30. The Eastland filled fast, well over 2,000 passengers in a matter of minutes. Many went below, out of the drizzle. Many more crowded the upper decks to wave at the crowd and watch the river. And almost as soon as the people came aboard, the ship began to lean. She leaned toward the dock. The crew worked the ballast tanks, the ship's underwater counterweights, trying to level her. She leaned the other way, out toward the river. They fought it again. To the passengers on deck, laughing and calling to friends, it felt like nothing. A boat rocking at its mooring. Normal. It was not normal. With every degree she rolled toward the river. Water crept closer to the openings low on her side. The gangways, the portholes left open for air. The ship was balanced on the edge of the very tipping point we talked about earlier, and she was sitting still. She hadn't even cast off. Exactly what tipped the balance in the final seconds is still argued about. Some said passengers drifted to one side to watch a passing boat. Survivors mostly disagreed. They said the crowd was spread evenly, that there was no rush. It may not have needed one. A ship that close to the edge needs almost nothing to push it over. At 7:28, the Eastland reached the angle she could not come back from. What happened next took less than 2 minutes, and it happened to thousands of people who were trapped inside before they understood anything was wrong. The Eastland rolled completely onto her side and settled onto the river bottom. Because the water was only about 20 feet deep, she didn't disappear. She just lay there, half out of the water, in the middle of the city. The people on the upper decks were thrown into the river. Many of them could be reached. The danger up top was real, but it was survivable. The people below deck were in a different situation entirely. When a ship rolls onto its side, the floor becomes a wall. Doorways end up sideways. Furniture and everything not bolted down slides into a single corner. In the dark, underwater, with no way to tell up from down, the way out simply isn't where your body expects it to be. This is why the Eastland was so deadly despite being so close to safety. The Titanic took over 2.5 hours to sink, and most of its lifeboats got away. The Eastland took under 2 minutes to capsize, and the people most at risk never had a chance to move. The coroner's physician who examined the victims concluded that most of them had not drowned in open water. They had been trapped. In the end, at least 844 people died. Most were never more than a few yards from dry land. And then the city arrived. The rescue began within seconds and lasted for hours. A nearby ship pulled alongside the hull so survivors could climb across. Workers with acetylene torches cut holes directly into the steel side of the Eastland, reaching down to pull people out. And they did pull dozens out alive. People on the docks threw crates and barrels into the water for the swimmers to grab. But for most of those below deck, there was no time left to save. By some estimates, 500,000 people came to the river to see it. A nearby armory was turned into a temporary morgue, where families walked the rows searching for the people who had left for a picnic that morning. The numbers become unbearable when you make them small. 22 entire families were wiped out, every member gone. One family lost 7 people, a father, a mother, and their 5 children. The city did not have enough hearses. It did not have enough gravediggers. And there's a detail history almost kept. A young man named George Halas was supposed to be aboard that morning. He was running late and reached the dock after the ship had already gone over. His name appeared on an early list of the dead, but he had survived. He would go on to found and coach the Chicago Bears. For every story like his, the near miss, the lucky delay, there were hundreds with no such ending. The last known survivor of the Eastland was 3 years old that day. She lived to be 102, carrying the memory of it for nearly a century. The Eastland was pulled upright a few weeks later and eventually sold to the Navy. They renamed her, converted her into a training ship, and she served quietly for decades before being scrapped after the Second World War. The ship outlived almost everyone who died on her. And the legal reckoning? There wasn't one. The crew was found not guilty. The owners were found not liable. The courts reasoned that the Eastland had passed her inspections and been declared seaworthy. So, how could anyone be blamed? The lawsuits were thrown out on appeal. To this day, no single official cause was ever formally settled. So here's where the Eastland leaves us. A ship that everyone knew was unsafe. Warnings on the record for over a decade. A safety law, written in grief after the Titanic, that loaded the fatal weight onto her upper decks. More than 800 working people, many of them women and children, dead a few yards from shore, in front of a watching city. And at the end of it, the law said no one had done anything wrong. The lifeboats added to the Eastland to prevent another Titanic were never needed to save a single life. The ship never made it out of the river. They only ever made her heavier. Today there's a small marker near the spot. Most people who pass it have never heard the name. The Eastland doesn't have a famous film or a song everyone knows. It has a stretch of river that looks like any other, and a number that should have made it impossible to forget. 844 people, a few yards from shore. That's where this one rests, below the wake. If you want more stories, the history books left underwater, subscribe. There are a lot of them, and they deserve to be remembered.